Hi.
Hi.
I'm just gonna. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. So this is our Live with Scientists event of the month. This month we're going to talk about. Well, at the moment we're going to talk to Alexus Davis, who is a PhD student, and her work focuses on birth narratives of women in First Nation women in Australia, and it considers disparity of maternal health outcomes for First Nation women in Australia, and focuses on the importance of indigenized knowledge as well as decolonial methodologies in perinatal care. And this is kind of in the context where this month we're kind of focuses on generally history of science. That's kind of like our theme, and we thought it would be really interesting because maternal care in the history of so throughout the history uh, has had a lot of changes, and there's been a lot of perhaps a lot of kind of advances, but also maybe some things that are not quite going forward, and we'll kind of discuss this with Lexi in a minute. But first of all, thank you so much, Lexi, for being here.
Thank you for having
And
me.
yeah, no, well, it's a pleasure. And I wanted to kick off with the first question was, what drew you to the area of research, which I think is fascinating. But how did you kind of ended up? How did you end up in this area of research?
Well, I think I've been really interested in maternity more widely for a very long time, and I will say since undergrad. I think since my undergraduate thesis, I've sort of been examining epistemic hierarchy in maternal care. I did my undergraduate degree in comparative literary and cultural studies and environmental science, but I had a bit of a time away in Erasmus in Dublin, Ireland, where I spent a lot of time sort of considering some of the histories of maternal care and some of the very fraught histories when it comes to reproductive justice there. And that really inspired me to begin to question how it is we understand knowledge, particularly in maternal care, which by then was already a huge interest of mine. A little bit after that, I decided that I would apply to medical school. So I spent a couple of years in Dundee doing biomedical sciences and still having, it was really for my prerequisites, but I still had this really strong urge to examine the maternal experience, whether that experience was sort of embodied or personal. So I even remember writing, and I'm sure I very much annoyed my advisor, but writing a paper about like the biomechanics of vaginal birth. So even when I wasn't really focusing on narratives, I was still really engaged with the maternal experience. And then in my master's, I began to sort of, from a more critical lens, examine what was happening with World Health Organizational policy when it comes to midwives who were, giving service to women in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And after my master's, I found myself here, sort of doing a very similar thing with maternal narratives for First Nations Australian women. I think for me, the issue is also a little bit existential as a Black American woman, and being very aware of some of the maternal mortality and morbidity rates for Black American women, and being very aware also of Black women's experiences when it comes to giving birth. So I think that's what a lot of things inspired me for a long time, but I've sort of been encircling this question of maternity and motherhood and the care that surrounds it.
Sorry, is the drawback to having children at home? No, I'm sorry.
Perfect timing,
Speaking of maternal care, but yeah, can you go downstairs, guys, please? Thank you. I I think, I mean, this is exactly why I thought it would be really interesting, and I really appreciate that you're here and talking to us because, oh, I'm sorry. um because I think this is a subject where, precisely like when we track kind of the history and going back and forth, what you mentioned, like, I think the cultural context is particularly important. And I think, what we were saying before, like, we have a lot of technological advances maybe that will contribute to better maternity care, lowering mortality. It doesn't happen for every woman in the world, basically. And I think, I would like you to kind of tell us, from your perspective, from the research that you're conducting, how do you think the cultural context contributes to the quality of maternity care that maybe, women across the world receive, um, in general, maybe just.
Yeah, I feel like there are different histories of maternal care, and they're in different contexts of maternal care. And in my research now, which has to do with First Nations Australian women's narratives of the type of care that they receive and whether or not it's sort of culturally safe, is one of my main research questions. I found that through the process of the research, what I was really examining a good portion of the time was hermeneutic injustice and the sort of tricky and sticky elements of epistemic hierarchy within the maternal care system in Australia, and how those inequalities persist. And this is ultimately a reproductive justice issue. So, with every sort of cultural context for maternity care, there's also a history of wider medical care services, medical care professionals, and personnel. And there are ways in which histories of colonialism and dispossession really affect those contexts. And sort of going through the research and sort of finding that there was just so little for me to draw upon sort of in my literature review. And of course, my research sort of intersected, unfortunately, with COVID. So a lot of things had to be moved online, and I had to sort of operate very creatively from a methodological standpoint. But I found that there were very few stories sort of readily available of First Nations women compared to non-First Nations, non-Indigenous Australian women. And I eventually came to learn that there are fewer than 300 First Nations Australian midwives in the whole of the country, which was, when it comes to people sort of taking the lead, when it comes to culturally safe care, Indigenous birth professionals are really on that sort of at the front of the line for that. And they know how important it is. And there is like a really significant maternal mortality and morbidity rate for First Nations women, Australian women specifically. And it became very clear to me over time that a lot of that had to do with the type of care that they were receiving and whether or not it was culturally competent, whether or not it had the appropriate context for some of the needs and desires, and whether it was whether those people were being met with racial bias, which we know happens a lot in medicine. All of that is a part of a historical and cultural context.
I think that's really kind of to the point, and I love it that you mentioned, because so we're obviously talking about history of science, and you're right. I think, in general, history of science is marred with, like, historical, maybe, racism and colonialist narratives, and that kind of feeds into all of it. I'm going to plug here a blog that was written by one of our volunteers as well, precisely kind of going back to kind of the history of genetics, and how sometimes genetics is used to kind of enforce those narratives. And I think in terms of maternity, when you talk about the epistemological hierarchy and how, like, especially in cultural context where there is that disparity between maybe ancestral knowledge and sort of knowledge that kind of takes into account the cultural um, context, and then maybe the more generalized and possibly more kind of westernized to call it something, but perhaps that's not the best but the best term, but to kind of like the more generalized, when you were talking about the general guidelines from maybe the World Health Organization and how they're applied in different cultures. And I feel when you talk about maternal mortality, perhaps kind of the main, or the sort of sometimes the argument would be like, oh well, of course, because they're not following the guidelines, because they're not, like, this is our infrastructure, and this is how we do things now, and this is how we lower mortality, when in reality it's almost the opposite. It's kind of like not taking into account these ancestral maybe practices, and practices that are meeting the needs of women in different communities and different circumstances. That's what makes it kind of um, even like sometimes more dangerous. And I think, yeah, I think you're right. So but I think that kind of leads to the next question that I had, that it was sort of like, do you think that what we might know as sort of developed nations, there is a sense that there is like a right way to provide maternity care, and they kind of sideline the other kind of practices, and does that impact, or how does that impact maternal care?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that, we can sort of see the way that maybe more mainstream care practices are prioritized within medical systems, even outside of the West, these sort of medical systems that maybe westernized is the right word for them, how they're imposed in a lot of places. But I feel as though, and I think the research has really shown to me that when we don't listen to birthing people, that leads to a lot of the more adverse events when it comes to birth. So you were mentioning earlier that medical systems often have these sort of set protocol when it comes to giving birth, and also when it comes to explaining, or maybe even explaining away, some of the more adverse events. And I found within my research that there's a lot of pathologizing of the behaviors of First Nations Australian women, and pathologizing in a way that, it often reads to me, and it's been critiqued by many Indigenous scholars, as these sort of afterlives of sort of really unfortunate and racist colonial narratives about First Nations people. So instead of listening to a particular birth practice that might make someone more comfortable, sort of regardless of what kind of birth they were giving, that they're giving, there's more of a focus on maybe what that person's home life is like, or there is often a sort of implication that they might smoke or participate in all of these harmful activities, and this sort of continues to build the stigma around these people that is often the result of a very long and horrible colonial history. And a lot of my research is also, I could have mentioned this before, inspired by Dr. Geronimus's work on allostatic load for Black women, and sort of preterm aging of reproductive organs, and how those factors influence the Black maternal mortality and morbidity rate. And while I can't sort of take that epigenetic framework and put it on another population of people, I think examining these environmental factors, like context for care that just don't fit is a really important way to critique the way that we understand, or the way that we've practiced care, the way Western states have maybe imposed care paradigms on groups of people that sort of maybe inadvertently, but nonetheless extend this post-colonial violence.
Yeah, I think that is a great point as well. And I mean, there's also the other side where we see, for example, I mean, that's another one of the questions that I had. Like, we know now, because there's quite a lot of evidence that has been discovered of records where maybe even you know there were kind of practices in other places in the world, obstetric practices like C-section, for example, that was happening in other places in the world way before it was happening in Europe. And particularly, I think very recently, I think there was in the news or social media, which is kind of the news these days, about a very specific kind of African nation, I think, and there were records of missionaries or somebody who was trying to kind of record their practices, and he described something that was, like, it was clearly, it was a C-section, and that was many years before it had sort of it started in Europe. And I think sometimes that is kind of erased, that doesn't really come, like, we don't really know about these practices. So I wonder how many, if there are any other sorry, Killian, I am talking, can I talk? um
Really?
okay, okay,
We're in the door.
all right, mister, I am talking to somebody, can you go downstairs with daddy, please? Thank you, I'll come and talk to you later. I wonder if there are other examples of these instances where it's almost like we're again trying to kind of like, we have these mainstream practices, but there were other practices, or there are now, even now, in other communities or cultures, practices that are equally as valuable, and we just don't hear about them. And we might be able to kind of enrich the general knowledge about maternity care with practices that we just don't hear about because they're not part of the kind of mainstream. I don't know what you.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of my research considers a First Nations Australian birthing practice and philosophy called birthing on country. And it is when an Indigenous person decides to give birth sort of on or incorporating the land and or culture from their nation within the birth process itself. And it is through my research, I've seen and heard in the narrative that practices like birthing on country, the lights went off in here. Practices like birthing on country are often stigmatized by medicine, by medicine in Australia. And birthing on country, however, has had really positive outcomes as a practice. And, operating within people's cultural safety, in particular, like contexts and narratives that support senses of belonging, and that kind of work to heal the violence of colonialism are really important. I found in my research that there are ways that the prenatal care in Australia often intersects with the state, which replicates this kind of, for example, women who do not attend a certain number of prenatal visits, sort of once they're checked in with a hospital, particularly First Nations women, because they're sort of stigmatized, may run the risk, and I've heard this from participants, of being reported to Child Protective Services. So there are cultural practices that sort of imbue the sense of safety and belonging that are often underfunded, but have really great outcomes for these people because they are contextually specific and culturally safe. And they look to sort of heal the pathologizing that those birthing people experienced at the hands of mainstream care.
Yeah, I think that's very important. And maybe this is also kind of like leading to another one of my questions, because I know you mentioned before in your in our kind of previous conversations that you also practice you are practicing doula. Is that right? And
Yes.
I wanted to ask you about that because I feel like maybe, or I don't know if this is your feeling as well, there's some misconceptions about the practice that you've kind of come across, and you know, like, but mainly, what do you think is sort of the benefits and the main reasons why you would recommend this? In general, and also in the context of the different, you know, cultural in different cultural contexts as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I work as a doula. I have been a doula for a few years. I'm a full spectrum doula. So I work with prenatal care and planning. I work in advocacy. My master's was in global health ethics and law. So I find myself sort of well suited for advocacy. But you know, doulas have different scopes of practice. I have a bit of training in lactation, and I also do postpartum support. So doulas sort of offer non-medical support to birthing people. So in the capacity and scope of their practice. And I too have sort of come across some misconceptions when it comes to doula care. And I do know that in the UK, I'm originally from the US, and currently my practice is, because I am in the UK finishing my PhD, my practice is sort of limited to online postpartum support. And right now I'm in a doula co-op, which is based in New York. And we have contracts with New York Presbyterian Hospital and Columbia Medical Center, sort of caring for those birthing people in a postpartum capacity in really close relationship with their doctors. So in the scope of my practice and what I'm doing right now is offering support and advice that is supported by research, and also sort of not just lending emotional support, but also being sort of like an impartial person. Doulas also work to support the sort of changes that happen in the family, particularly in a postpartum capacity. And also a lot of my clients, I would say that most of my clients are people of color. So there is sort of like an element of cultural safety that I look to imbue within my practice with my clients for the care that they will sort of receive immediately after the birth. And this is, again, sort of in close conversation with their doctors and care professionals.
I think this is, I mean, that is exactly, I guess, one of the things maybe to aspire to is to, you know, like kind of to try and bring down the stigma of practices that, like, you know, culturally sensitive practices, and just trying to bring things together. Like, it's not one against the other, but things should complement, because birthing, the whole birthing process is not only a medical process. There's a lot involved, and it obviously, you know, like you said, it's very important for the birthing person to feel safe. I think that is kind of the main thing, and I think that's possibly one of the things that sometimes, when people talk about obstetric violence and sort of like traumatizing experiences during birth, it is about that sense of not feeling in control, not feeling safe. And I think if we could just kind of bring these things together, that would make a lot of difference. But and the other thing I wanted to ask you, because I know that you also use poetry in your research, and I thought that was extremely interesting, because is not necessarily something you think would be kind of like would come hand in hand with maternity care. So I would like to kind of ask you, what is the process? I mean, why? Because I think this is amazing. Why did you? I mean, how did you come to that intersection, let's say, and how, what is the process, and how does it help?
Yeah, you know, I am a poet myself. So I found myself, you know, continuing to write my poetry during the PhD. And in fact, I think a good a good year and a half of the PhD, I was working on my first full collection of poems, which was recently published. So, you know, towards uh, within the first 6 months, when we were sort of making decisions about methodology, sort of right before COVID happening, I made a decision to include poetic inquiry as a part of my research as an effort to sort of begin the decolonial project when it came to the research. Unfortunately, there is a long-standing history of sort of extraction and research from First Nations people. And I am not a First Nations Australian person, so I found it really important to have a decolonial praxis within my methods and within my methodology. So I ended up deciding to have a methodological paradigm called Indigenous Research at the Interface, where I would use a sort of a mix of Western and Indigenous methods in order to conduct my research. So I ended up having, well, the initial plan was to do my field work and work with people who were preparing to give birth in sort of like a workshop capacity. And they would all sort of write poems together about their experience within maternal care when it came to the care that they were receiving. And then we would have sort of another set of collective poetry workshops after the birth that were more focused on that experience. But COVID threw me for a little bit of a loop, and I ended up doing poetic inquiry through transcripts with the interviews and podcasts that featured First Nations Australian women's birthing stories. And I created transcript poems from that. So I ended up this three-pronged indigenized research at the interface methodology, using it sort of through analysis. So I ended up using narrative analysis when it came to the transcripts from my interviews and from those birth stories. I used interpretive phenomenological analysis, which is sort of based on affect, so how people were saying they felt, and sort of examining that from the lens of poetic inquiry in those transcript poems. And with those transcript poems, because as I continued to do this research, I found that it was not only sort of a one-way examination, which I think was really important for me when it came to recognizing my standpoint as a Black American researcher doing this work, but that the reflection and the reflexivity was sort of going both ways. So I ended up also writing some auto-ethnopoetic pieces about what it means for me to do this research and engage in sort of Black Indigenous solidarity when it comes to this really important issue that affects people's lives. So that's how I ended up using poetry. It first started out as my sort of my natural mode, being a poetry writing person, a creative writing person. But as I continued and as it really sharpened in my mind that I needed this to be a decolonial project, if I wanted to engage in reproductive justice through my research as a praxis, then that's what I needed to do.
I feel this is really interesting, because I feel again, if we go back kind of historically, when we think about research and science, and it's all very kind of rigorous and very, and in fact, I feel there's been a lot of intersection between art and generally kind of any sort of emotive expression as well, and science, and they kind of are intertwined. And I think that's really important to kind of continue that, and because there's really no separation, and like you said, it is a powerful tool as well for integrating ideas and communicating with other people, and sort of like in your case, also exploring your own sort of a connection to your own work, and how that this it's kind of like to take it forward. So that's really interesting.
It was also really important to me. I'm sorry. It was also
No,
really
no.
important to me, I think, because there were so few accounts of the experiences of First Nations Australian women giving birth and the types of care that they were receiving, that not only do I showcase those stories, but in my research, I make it my priority to draw the link between having effective health policy that is inclusive of people's experiences. And I think that that's sort of where I began to find the hermeneutic injustice, in that there wasn't a theorized maternal phenomenology that included the First Nations experience, whether it was the experience of dispossession from the land or connection to it. It just really wasn't a part of the discourse. And we do have a Western tradition of maternal phenomenology that has gone on through sort of feminist political projects at the intersection of maternal care and addressing obstetric violence. That exists for Westernized people, and I found it really disturbing that health policy could be created for people whose stories were so difficult to find. So that was, sort of another huge driver. And I wanted to use a decolonial series of methodological frameworks in order to address that.
Yeah, that's exactly that's really important, and I think that goes beyond maternity care. I think the work that you're doing, even though it's focused on this particular subject, I think this is an issue that permeates every aspect of medical care, really. I mean, I can think of other parallels like mental health care, and even sometimes like physical health for people with certain disabilities or certain cultural backgrounds. It is, like it's something that, so your work can inform other areas of care. So that's really interesting and really important. I've got some questions from other people. So I think because we still have a little bit of time, so I'm just going to read them to you, and then you can sort of give me your idea. So one of them is, as well as a culture need being dismissed in maternity practice, I imagine the fact that the medical doctor profession is still dominated by men will also compound how standardized or westernized maternity practice might not be appropriate. I know a junior doctor that vouches for C-section in every birth. He's obviously a man. Have you found any evidence in your research that gender adds to the complexity of the issue that you are highlighting?
Yes, absolutely. I think sort of at that intersection of gender and ethnicity, do we start to see the most sort of leaning towards the most cultural competency? And I use the word cultural competency with a little bit of pause, because, and I say this sort of as a critique in my research, but the move towards cultural competency in medicine is really a definition of a type of service provision. And that still doesn't center the birthing person. But I will say that at least in my research, and at least in the narratives that I have experienced, I have seen sort of more negative experience and sometimes more negative outcomes with some of the professionals who were male as opposed to women, but also more so when there was non-Indigenous sort of medical professionals being dismissive of a particular type of care needed, if that makes sense.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Then someone else asked, what is being done to change policies and procedures within the NHS and beyond to change maternal care? I don't know whether this is kind of like something that you can comment on, but yeah, just give me your thoughts on that.
I can't speak too much for the NHS's context, and most of my doula clientele are based in the U.S., so I can speak for the U.S. and particularly in communities of color, doulas are becoming more a part of the conversation, and there has been a really significant push in reproductive justice sort of activist communities towards including doulas as a part of care that is insured in the United States. I think as of right now, there are 4 states in the US where doulas are sort of included in mainstream insurance, as well as so corporatized sort of mainstream insurance, as well as I believe Medicaid. So that is, I think, pretty incredible in itself, and that is sort of a new thing that's happening because there were so many doulas and other birth professionals, along with birthing people, engaging in advocacy for a particular type of care, for a care that was really centered around safety, belonging, and community. So I can definitely speak to what's happening in the States, and even now in my doula co-op, we are again based in New York, but New York is one of those places where we were able to win that support for birthing people. So the care that we provide can be covered by insurance, and inequalities in care because of someone's socioeconomic status can be, we can balance out that inequality through that legislation to include doula care in insurance. So that's what I know is happening in the US.
Absolutely. It'd be really interesting to see the statistics after, after this kind of like in the before and after this change happened, and hopefully, like to see how that changes outcomes of maternal care. That would be great. And then also, well, I guess this kind of sort of relates to it. And have you noticed if there has been an increase in demand for doula care in the last few years? Well, healthcare systems have been under extra pressure, and people perhaps haven't received the close contact they expect from a medical team. I guess that's kind of like related. But is there an extra? Is there also an extra demand for it, do you think?
I think so, and I think along with doulas becoming a part of a more mainstream conversation about quality of care and birth, that sort of being intersected with a lot of care being moved online because of the pandemic. Doulas who are operating in a virtual capacity, particularly prior to birth and then in postpartum capacities, have really been leading that demand. I think when people are able to recognize that doulas can provide that care or can provide one-on-one support in the home, wherein a doctor may not make a bedside visit in the way that we know historically many of them have in the past, that doulas have sort of become the people to turn to. And I think that there is a lot of, I think, rightful controversy surrounding sort of holistic movements in birth care. Sometimes they can get a bit, sometimes they're not always driven by good science, or sometimes not even good practice, or even some of the ancestral knowledges that we know work, or that we know have had good outcomes. But outside of those issues, I think people are becoming more comfortable with the idea of doula support as a part of their medical care team. And I think part of that has to do with a lot of the move that we have had online, and the lack of ability for care systems to always accommodate birthing people, particularly during this mass several-year-long emergency.
Yes, I think that's an important distinction. That the kind of like this is trying to integrate the good practices and integrate what you were saying, ancestral knowledge, not necessarily phase out or kind of like replace one for the other, but just kind of try and make the most of the general knowledge and include practices, especially because obviously not everything works for everybody, but when it is obvious that it is required, an extra element is required to make, again, the birthing person feel safe and and listened to as well. Like, it's that kind of, again, going back to the epistemological hierarchy, like when you kind of when you're treating people and you're almost not giving them the autonomy to decide or to have an input or an opinion about what's happening to them. And so that's kind of very important to have that extra voice, I think, in your practice as a doula. I think to have that kind of extra support, and yeah, and then hopefully that will become slightly more people will kind of take it up, and hopefully that will become more of a mainstream. Is there, like, for kind of like trying to wrap up, but is there anything that you feel from your experience and your research and your practice even, that you say, like, this is kind of like one of the pressing things that we need to improve maternal care, and intersectionally as well, because obviously, like we said, different birthing people have different needs and different contexts. Is there anything that you can kind of hone in, or a few things? I don't know.
I think having a diverse representation of birth professionals, I think, is really important. Having a whole birth team, because doulas are evidence-based birth professionals who have different scopes of practices and different expertise. You have lactation consultants who focus on feeding. You have doulas who sort of work with positioning in physiological birth. I know within my training, we use the practice is, I believe it originated in Mexico, the rebozo, the long sort of cloth that's sort of used to move breached babies into the right position prior to birth. Those are evidence-based practices, and doulas have different scopes and capacities of care, but there are experts who can do certain things to help the outcome when the time comes. So even further than making a birthing person feel safe and supported, and that the care that they're receiving is contextually sound from a cultural standpoint, all of that is absolutely critical and some of the driving arguments of my research. But I would also say that doulas have evidence-based care that have yielded good outcomes, very similarly to midwives. I know that we more recently have caught on to the absolute value of midwives and how differing those care outcomes can be from just sort of standardized obstetric care in birth. So I think engaging with a diverse birth team and having that be a more standardized practice is something really important and something that I hope is included in the future of birth care, because every birthing person deserves to feel that supported with that many people on their side, ready to address whatever issues come up.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's a key sort of including diverse people with diverse backgrounds and relevant context as well, relevant cultural context. That's the key. For again, I think obviously we're talking about maternity and maternal care, but I think in any practice, in any medical care practice, that would be kind of the goal in general. Um, so, well, I mean, I don't think there are any more comments from the public, but if you unless you want to add anything on, Lexi, anything else that you want to add on to finish off our Q&A?
I think that that's everything from me.
Thank you so much. That was an incredibly interesting conversation. It was lovely to have you. Thank you so much for agreeing to do
Thank
this and for
you.
sharing your research with us. Best of luck with the end of the doctorate, and I mean,
Thanks so
we
much.
honestly we look forward to hearing from your future research as well, because this is an amazingly important and present subject, and yeah, we'll look forward to hear from you in the future. But thank you very much, and thank you for anyone who's listening live now. This is going to remain on our website for for anyone who wants to come and listen to our conversation. But for now, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you for coming.